30 missed calls. That stark number greeted Elias when he finally reactivated his phone. 30 calls from his son, Marcus. 9 voicemails, 23 text messages, and a final, desperate plea. "Dad, please call me. I was wrong. Please." Elias stared at the illuminated screen, alone in a small rustic inn room overlooking the stormy, churning gray expanse of the North Sea. Outside, the wind howled, whipping sea spray against the window pane. Inside, a fire crackled softly in the old stone hearth, casting dancing shadows across the heavy oak beams. For a long moment, Elias remained perfectly still, the silence of the room punctuated only by the distant roar of the ocean and the occasional groan of the old building. Just 2 days prior, Marcus had stood in a brightly lit, opulent city apartment before a room full of sophisticated guests and dismissed Elias as a relic of a bygone era, his own son. The boy Elias had dedicated his entire life to, the one he had painstakingly raised after his beloved Clara, and he had poured every ounce of their being into giving him a brighter future. And now, Marcus wanted to talk. But before Elias could delve into the whirlwind of those 30 calls, he needed to recount the events of that fateful Christmas day. Elias Finch, at 72 years old, was a retired Coast Guard veteran and a widower. For over 30 years, he had served as a lighthouse keeper, his life a steady rhythm of watch duty, maintenance, and the lonely vigil over the sea. Up until that Christmas dinner, he had held a quiet belief that his son, Marcus, respected him. He had been wrong. Christmas had always been the anchoring point of their family year. After Clara, his wife, passed away 6 years earlier, the holidays had taken on an even more profound, almost sacred meaning. She had been the radiant heart of every Christmas celebration, the meticulous decorations, the aroma of her legendary clam chowder, the cherished traditions, the joyous laughter that filled every corner. After her departure, Elias had striven with all his might to keep those traditions alive. Not purely for the joy of Christmas itself, but because it made him feel closer to her, as if her spirit still lingered in the familiar rituals. That particular Christmas morning began with a quiet melancholy. Elias awoke in his modest, weather-beaten cottage perched on a cliff overlooking the turbulent waters, just a stone's throw from the lighthouse he once tended. He brewed a strong pot of coffee, watching the relentless drizzle turn the landscape a somber gray, and gazed at Clara's photograph on the kitchen counter. "Wish you were here, my love," he whispered, his voice hoarse with unspoken longing. For 3 days, he had painstakingly baked Clara's famous seafood pie, following her handwritten recipe to the letter. Marcus, as a boy, had adored that pie, asking for it every single year, and every year Clara had made it. After she was gone, Elias had taken up the mantle. It was never quite as sublime as hers, but he continued to try, driven by a deep-seated devotion. He carefully packed the pie into a carrier and loaded it into his old, sturdy pickup truck, alongside wrapped gifts for Marcus, his wife Serena, and his 2 boisterous grandchildren. The drive to the city took nearly an hour and a half. The coastal roads were slick with the persistent rain, reflecting the gray sky like a polished mirror. Old sea shanties played softly through the truck's worn speakers. For most of the journey, Elias felt a familiar blend of happiness, anticipation, and hope. He imagined Clara's delighted smile, seeing everyone gathered together. When he pulled into Marcus' sprawling city apartment complex, the building shimmered with festive lights. Marcus's unit, high above the bustling streets, glowed with a warm, inviting yellow. Laughter, faint and joyous, drifted down every time a window or door opened. Elias took a deep breath, grabbed the pie and gifts, and headed inside. The moment the door opened, a medley of aromas enveloped him: roasted turkey, exotic spices, freshly baked artisanal bread, and a hint of expensive perfume. For a fleeting instant, everything felt perfect. His grandchildren, 8-year-old Leo and 6-year-old Maya, spotted him immediately and raced over, throwing themselves into his arms. Grandpa, their hugs, always so pure and unrestrained, never failed to brighten his day. He handed them their presents, and they shrieked with excitement, rushing off to find a quiet corner. Then he noticed it. The dining area had been completely transformed. Marcus and Serena hosted Christmas every year now, moving from their old house to this new, minimalist apartment. Usually, Elias's place was at the head of the table, a spot Clara always insisted he take. Not because he demanded it, but because it felt right, a place of honor. But this year, something was conspicuously different. A heavy-set man in an impeccably tailored cashmere sweater was holding forth, laughing loudly, a crystal goblet of wine cradled in his hand. It was Mr. Thorne, Serena's father. Elias liked Mr. Thorne well enough. They weren't close, but their interactions had always been civil, if a little stiff. Elias assumed there had been some oversight, some mistake. So, he set down Clara's pie on a nearby side table and walked towards Marcus, who was engrossed in a conversation on his sleek smartphone. "Hey son," Elias said, trying to keep his voice light. Marcus barely looked up. "Hey Dad." Elias gestured subtly toward the dining table. "I think someone's in my spot." Marcus glanced over, then shrugged dismissively. "Oh yeah, that was all. Just, oh yeah." Elias waited, expecting an explanation, an apology, a solution. None came. Finally, Elias asked, his patience thinning, "So, where am I sitting?" Marcus pointed vaguely toward a small, uncomfortable-looking stool tucked away near the kitchen entrance, not at the table, off to the side. Like an afterthought. Elias actually chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. Not because it was funny, but because he thought Marcus must be joking. He wasn't. Serena glided over, a forced smile on her lips. "We had to make some adjustments this year, Elias. We needed a better aesthetic." "A better aesthetic?" Elias looked at the lonely stool, then back at Marcus's indifferent face. A cold knot formed in his stomach. Something felt deeply wrong. But he didn't want to cast a pall over the holiday. So he let it go, at least for the moment. Dinner commenced about 30 minutes later. More guests had arrived. Colleagues from Marcus's architectural firm, several of Serena's socialite friends, a few faces Elias had never seen before. At one point, one of Serena's friends, a woman with a perfectly coiffed blonde bob, leaned over and asked Marcus, "And who is this charming gentleman?" The question seemed harmless enough. Elias offered a polite smile. Before he could respond, Marcus let out a short, hollow laugh. A laugh that Elias would replay in his mind for days. Then Marcus said something that would forever echo in Elias' memory. "Oh, that's just my dad." The room seemed to hold its breath. Marcus took a casual sip of wine, then added, his voice laced with a condescending amusement, "Just an old sea dog who still thinks people want to hear his outdated tales from the lighthouse and the Coast Guard." For a second, nobody reacted. Not because they agreed, but because they were visibly shocked. The silence that descended upon the room was immense, suffocating. Elias felt every eye in the room swivel toward him. Some guests looked embarrassed, others quickly averted their gaze. The blonde woman actually winced. Mr. Thorne shifted uncomfortably in Elias' customary seat. "My seat," Marcus chuckled again, as if he'd just delivered a perfectly harmless, witty quip. Serena offered a nervous, tight-lipped smile, but no one else laughed. Not a single person. Elias sat there, staring at his plate, the carefully arranged gourmet food suddenly tasteless. His face felt hot, but he wasn't angry, not at first. He was hurt. Deeply, profoundly hurt. Because the insult wasn't really about his stories. It wasn't about a chair or a stool. It wasn't about Christmas, it was about respect. And in that agonizing moment, Elias understood a painful truth. His son had stopped respecting him a long time ago. This was simply the first time he'd had the audacity to say it out loud. Suddenly, a torrent of memories flooded Elias's mind. Working grueling double shifts as a deckhand after his Coast Guard service, moonlighting on fishing trawlers at night, missing family holidays, selling his beloved vintage sextant, a family heirloom, to help pay Marcus's tuition for his prestigious architecture university, working every single extra shift available at the lighthouse after Clara fell ill, sacrificing things he had never once mentioned to his son. Not because he craved gratitude, but because that's what parents did. You gave, you sacrificed, you loved, and you simply hoped it mattered. Elias looked around the room one last time, the glittering decorations and expensive clothes now mocking him. Then, quietly, he rose. No one stopped him. No one asked where he was going. He walked to the towering, beautifully decorated Christmas tree, placed his carefully wrapped gifts beneath it, picked up his worn overcoat, and headed for the door. The rain was falling harder now, driven by a biting wind. The cold, salty air hit his face like a slap. Behind him he could still hear the drone of conversation continuing inside, as if nothing untoward had happened, as if he had never been there at all. He climbed into his old truck, started the engine, and drove away. He had no specific destination in mind, only one certainty. For the first time in his life, he desperately needed to be somewhere his son wasn't. And as the rain-swept coastal road stretched ahead of him, disappearing into the gray twilight, Elias made a silent, firm decision. He would not answer his phone. Not tonight, not tomorrow, maybe not for a very long time. What he didn't know was that before Christmas was truly over, something forgotten for nearly 40 years was about to irrevocably change everything. The first night after leaving Marcus's apartment, Elias drove for almost 3 hours. Not because he had any particular place to go. He simply couldn't bear the thought of returning home. His cottage felt too quiet, too empty, too saturated with Clara's ghost and the crushing weight of his memories. Every Christmas since Clara had died had been difficult, a poignant ache, but this one felt different. This one ripped at his soul. Around 9 o'clock that evening, he found himself heading south, toward a small, historic coastal village he and Clara had frequented decades ago. Back when Marcus was in college, back when life had felt simpler, imbued with a quiet joy. There was a small family-owned inn near the old harbor, nestled among ancient oak trees. Nothing ostentatious, just a handful of charming rooms, a welcoming stone fireplace, and a sweeping view of the restless sea. The innkeeper, an old sea captain named Silas, recognized Elias immediately. Elias Finch. Well, I'll be damned, Silas laughed, his weathered face creasing into a familiar grin. They shook hands, a firm grip that spoke of shared history. The years had added silver to both their hair and deeper lines around their eyes. Silas had inherited the inn from his parents, just as Elias had inherited his post at the lighthouse. Elias hadn't been there in nearly 15 years. Christmas vacation? Silas asked, his eyes twinkling. Elias hesitated. Something like that. Silas, with the keen intuition of an old sailor, must have sensed there was more to the story, because he didn't press. Instead, he simply handed Elias a heavy brass-keyed room key. Room 3. It's got the best view of the cove. Appreciate it, Silas. Merry Christmas. The words, meant kindly, struck Elias with an unexpected pang. Merry Christmas. He thanked Silas and carried his bag inside. The room was warm, compact, and immensely comfortable, exactly what he needed. That night, Elias sat beside the fireplace, watching the flames dance and consume the old logs for hours. His phone vibrated several times. Marcus. He ignored it. Then Serena called. Ignored. Then another call and another. He finally silenced the phone completely, placing it face down on the small bedside table. He wasn't ready to talk. Not yet. Maybe not ever. The next morning, Elias woke before sunrise. Old Coast Guard habits, ingrained from decades of early watches, never truly left him. The sea outside looked dark and silent, shrouded in a thin, ethereal mist. He brewed a strong pot of coffee and sat by the window, watching the first blush of dawn paint the eastern horizon. For the first time in years, he spent Christmas morning completely alone. Oddly enough, it wasn't loneliness that troubled him. It was a profound disappointment. The kind that settles deep into your chest, heavy and cold. The kind that doesn't fade after a night's sleep. He thought about Marcus. Not the man who had humiliated him, but the little boy. The one who used to press his nose against the window pane, waiting for Elias to come home from his shifts at the lighthouse. The one who cried when Elias left for Coast Guard training exercises. The one who believed his father could fix anything. Sometimes, life changes people so gradually that you don't truly notice until one day you're staring at a stranger. That morning, Elias thought about all the things Clara and he had done for Marcus. Not because they expected repayment. Parents don't keep score. At least good parents don't. But when you've sacrificed so much, such blatant disrespect cuts deeper than any physical wound. Elias and Clara had never been wealthy, not even close. After Elias left active Coast Guard service, he took on every lighthouse keeper position he could get. Then he worked part-time on fishing boats. Whatever paid the bills. Some years were easier than others. Many weren't. When Marcus was 16, he desperately wanted to attend a prestigious summer program in naval architecture. The tuition wasn't astronomical by today's standards, but back then, it might as well have been a king's ransom. They simply didn't have it. Elias remembered sitting at their small kitchen table with Clara, poring over the numbers. They didn't work, not even close. The very next week, Elias sold his antique brass sextant. That sextant had been his one true luxury, passed down through generations of seafaring ancestors. His escape, his dream. He never told Marcus why it disappeared. He simply told him he'd traded it for a newer, more practical model. Then he paid Marcus's tuition for the summer program. Years later, when the hefty university expenses arrived, Elias worked weekends, guiding fishing charters and taking dangerous late-night shifts on supply boats to offshore platforms. Clara picked up extra hours at the village library. Together they made it work, barely. And they would do it again every single time because that's what parents do. Around noon on Christmas Day, his phone rang again. He ignored it. A few minutes later, another call came in. This one wasn't Marcus. The caller ID displayed a name he didn't recognize, Monsieur Davies' attorney. Normally he wouldn't have answered, but something, an inexplicable tug of curiosity, urged him to pick up. "Hello, Mr. Elias Finch?" A crisp professional voice inquired. "Speaking. My name is Ms. Davies. I'm an attorney with Davies and Sterling. I apologize for contacting you during the holidays." Elias frowned. "It's quite all right. What can I do for you?" There was a brief pause. "I'm handling the estate matters of a deceased client, Mr. Arthur Finch." The name immediately sounded familiar, echoing from a distant past. "Arthur Finch? Yes." Elias leaned back in his chair, a sudden jolt going through him. Good heavens. Arthur and Elias had served together in the Coast Guard decades earlier, even sharing a brief stint on the same patrol vessel. They weren't best friends, but they had stayed in touch for years after their service, exchanging Christmas cards and occasional calls. Elias hadn't spoken to him in at least a decade. "Arthur passed away?" Elias asked quietly, a wave of sadness washing over him. "I'm afraid so." "He was a good man," Elias murmured. "A good sailor." Ms. Davies continued. "There are several documents requiring your review and signature, Mr. Finch, regarding a substantial investment." "Investment records?" Elias laughed, a genuine surprised bark. "You've got the wrong Elias Finch." "Ms. Davies, I don't have investments." "No, sir. According to these records, you do." That got his attention. "What are you talking about?" Ms. Davies spent the next several minutes explaining, and honestly, at first, Elias barely understood what she was saying. 40 years earlier, Arthur had started a small maritime logistics company with 2 other Coast Guard veterans. The business had struggled initially. Most people, including Elias, had expected it to fail. Elias vaguely remembered Arthur asking if he could contribute a small amount, more as a gesture of friendship than a serious investment. Elias thought he'd written him a check for a few $1,000s, a significant sum for him at the time, but one he'd quickly forgotten. Life happened. Marriage, children, bills, work, the relentless demands of the lighthouse. The company had completely vanished from his mind. Apparently, it hadn't vanished. It had survived, then slowly grown, then expanded exponentially. Over the decades, it had become a respected regional leader in maritime shipping and port services. A few months earlier, a national corporation had acquired it in a massive deal. Ms. Davies finally arrived at the number. Elias nearly dropped his coffee mug. "Excuse me?" She repeated it. Elias still couldn't believe it. Millions. Not thousands. Millions. He sat in stunned silence. The crackling fireplace was the only sound in the room. Ms. Davies eventually asked if he was still there. "Yes, Miss Davies, I'm here. Would you like me to explain the figures again?" "No." Elias rubbed his forehead, a headache beginning to throb. "I heard you." The truth was, he wasn't excited. He knew that sounded strange. Most people would be celebrating, jumping up and down, calling family, popping champagne. Instead, he looked out at the churning gray sea. All he could think about was Clara. She should have been there. She should have seen this. After everything they had struggled through, after every sacrifice, she deserved this moment more than he did. Ms. Davies and Elias arranged a meeting after the new year. Then the call ended. Elias sat quietly for nearly an hour, Not thinking about money, but about life. Funny how things worked. The unexpected gift he'd spent decades earning, unknowingly, had arrived 6 years too late for the person he most wanted to share it with. Later that evening, he drove into the village for dinner, a simple meal at a local seafood diner, nothing fancy. When he returned to the inn, the rain had finally subsided, leaving the air crisp and clean. His phone remained off. He had no desire to speak to anyone, especially Marcus. What Elias didn't know was that back in the bustling city, his son was beginning to discover something unexpected, something that would make those 30 missed calls seem perfectly understandable. Because while Elias was sitting quietly beside a fireplace, a package had just arrived at his cottage, and inside that package were documents that would change everything. Elias knew none of it was happening. That was the strange part. While his son was spiraling into panic, Elias was sitting in a comfortable armchair beside a fire, watching the moonlight glimmer on the distant waves. The world felt peaceful, serene. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't rushing anywhere, wasn't solving anyone's problems, wasn't trying to keep a fragmented family together. He was simply sitting still, and maybe that's why he didn't turn his phone back on sooner. Part of him knew that if he heard Marcus's voice too soon, he'd give in. He'd forgive him before Marcus truly understood the depth of what he'd done. Elias had always had that weakness when it came to his son, even when Marcus was clearly in the wrong. Meanwhile, back in the city, Marcus was beginning to realize that Christmas dinner hadn't gone the way he'd expected. According to what he later told Elias, the first sign came that same evening. One of Serena's church friends, a kind-faced woman named Mrs. Peterson, approached him after dinner. She wasn't rude, just honestly concerned. "Marcus," she said quietly, "you should call your father." He looked very alone when he left. Marcus, still basking in the glow of his successful party, had apparently laughed. "Oh, he's fine. Just tired, I imagine." "No," Mrs. Peterson shook her head gently. "He isn't." Marcus brushed it off, as people often do when confronted with uncomfortable truths they'd rather avoid. The next morning, Christmas Day, he called Elias for the first time. No answer. Then another. No answer. By noon, he started texting. Nothing dramatic, just simple messages. "Dad, call me when you get this. Hope you're okay. Let's talk." Elias ignored every single one. That evening, Marcus drove to Elias's cottage. The driveway was empty. The porch lights were off. No one answered the door. Growing increasingly anxious, he used his spare key and went inside. The house was exactly as Elias had left it. The subtle Christmas decorations still glowed softly in the living room. Clara's photograph sat on the mantelpiece. The kitchen was spotless. The bed was made. But Elias was gone. Marcus later admitted that was the first moment he felt genuine fear. Not fear for himself, but fear for Elias. At 72, a man disappearing for 2 days wasn't the same as a 30-year-old disappearing. The possibilities became darker, more frightening, especially during the stormy winter, especially after a family argument. He searched the house for clues, a growing dread tightening his chest. That's when he noticed the package. It had arrived earlier that afternoon, a thick overnight envelope from Davies and Sterling attorneys, addressed to Elias. Normally, he would have left it alone, respecting his father's privacy, but he was worried, at least. That's what he told Elias later. Inside were copies of several documents Miss Davies had mailed ahead of their meeting. Ownership records, corporate acquisition notices, financial statements, legal correspondence, the kind of paperwork most people don't immediately understand. Marcus began reading, then reading again, then reading a third time, because what he thought he was seeing couldn't possibly be right. Not in his mind, at least. His father wasn't wealthy. His father drove a 12-year-old pickup truck. His father lived in a modest cottage. His father clipped coupons. His father bought coffee from gas stations instead of fancy city cafes. Elias's entire life looked ordinary, because it was ordinary, on the surface. But those documents told a dramatically different story, a story even Elias himself had forgotten until Miss Davies's call. Marcus called Elias again. No answer. Then he called Serena. Then his sister-in-law, Serena's younger sister, who happened to work in high finance. She reviewed the documents Marcus described, her voice growing increasingly astonished. Within 30 minutes, she confirmed what he suspected. The numbers were real, very real. Suddenly, Christmas dinner wasn't the only thing on Marcus' mind. Now he was trying desperately to understand who his father actually was. The following day, he began digging through old records in Elias's cottage. Not snooping, at least not intentionally, but looking for clues, for answers. What he found surprised him even more. Over the years, Elias had kept meticulously organized folders. Coast Guard records, tax returns, estate documents, charitable contributions, letters, photographs, an entire life neatly cataloged. One folder hit him particularly hard. It was labeled, Marcus Education. Inside were receipts stretching back decades, university tuition payments, housing costs, book fees, program expenses. Some pages had handwritten notes from Clara, her elegant script a stark contrast to the stark numbers. Others had calculations in Elias's own, firm handwriting. Every dollar carefully tracked, every sacrifice recorded. Marcus sat there for hours, rereading them, his face pale with a dawning comprehension. Then he found something else, a receipt from the sale of Elias's antique brass sextant. The same sextant Marcus had loved as a kid, imagining it guiding explorers across uncharted seas. The same sextant he thought Elias had sold because he wanted a newer, more practical one. Attached to the receipt was a small note from Clara, a simple note, only one sentence. Harold sold the sextant today so Marcus can attend the engineering program. Don't tell him, it'll embarrass him. Marcus stared at that note for a long, long time. At least that's what he told Elias later. Then came another discovery, Elias's estate file. Nothing secret, nothing dramatic, just practical, thoughtful planning, the kind older people should undertake. According to the documents, Elias had already arranged substantial charitable gifts, maritime preservation societies, Coast Guard benevolent funds, local community scholarship programs, even the small village food bank. Elias believed in leaving things better than he found them. The money wasn't earmarked for luxury. It was earmarked for purpose. Marcus said that was when everything finally started to sink in. For years, he had looked at Elias and seen an aging man living a simple, somewhat quaint life. What he hadn't seen was character, sacrifice, discipline, quiet generosity, things that don't show up in bank accounts or social status. Meanwhile, Serena was having her own reaction, and frankly, it wasn't flattering. At first, she focused entirely on the financial side. What does this mean? She reportedly asked, her voice hushed with awe. How much are we talking about, Marcus? Marcus didn't answer. She kept pressing, her questions growing more insistent. Eventually, he snapped, perhaps for the first time in years. This isn't about the money, Serena? According to him, the opulent room went silent. Then came an unexpected voice, Mr. Thorne. The father-in-law who had occupied Elias's seat, the man Elias had blamed for part of what happened. It turned out Elias had been wrong. Mr. Thorne looked directly at Marcus, his face unusually stern. Your father isn't the problem here, Marcus. Marcus stared at him, taken aback. Mr. Thorne continued, his voice low but firm. You humiliated that man. Nobody spoke. You should be ashamed of yourself. Now that surprised Elias when he heard it later. Life rarely gives us clear villains and heroes. Most people are far more complicated than that. Apparently, Mr. Thorne understood something Marcus didn't. Respect. By Monday afternoon, Marcus's panic had escalated into desperation. He called repeatedly. Voicemail. Again, voicemail. Again, voicemail. He left messages. Some angry, some emotional, some apologetic. Each one sounding more frightened and regretful than the last. By evening, the total had reached 30 missed calls. 30, and still, Elias hadn't listened to a single one. Back at the inn, Elias spent that evening sitting beside the fireplace. The rain and wind had finally died down. The sea reflected the moonlight like polished silver. For the first time since Christmas dinner, Elias felt calm. Not happy, but calm. Then he looked at his silent phone, resting on the small table beside his chair. Something inside him shifted, a subtle, almost imperceptible movement, like a tide turning. Maybe enough time had passed. Maybe he was finally ready. He picked up the phone, his thumb hovering over the power button. With a deep breath, he pressed it and watched the screen flicker to life. Almost immediately, a deluge of notifications flooded in. Messages, voicemails, missed calls. 30 missed calls. He stared at the number, a heavy ache in his chest, then at the final text. Dad, please call me. I was wrong. Please. For a long moment, Elias simply sat there, the weight of the past few days pressing down on him. Then, with a hesitant finger, he opened the voicemail folder and listened to the first message. The raw, desperate sound of his son's voice told him everything had changed. The first voicemail lasted only 12 seconds. Dad, it's me. Call me when you can. Nothing unusual, just a hint of urgency. The second was different. Marcus's voice sounded strained, a tremor underlying his usual composure. Dad, please, I know you're upset. Just let me know you're okay. By the fifth voicemail, Elias could hear fear creeping in, a genuine unsettling panic. By the ninth, he heard something he hadn't expected, something that pierced through his own hurt. Shame, real shame. Not mere embarrassment or frustration, but a profound, aching shame. He listened to every single message, sitting there beside the crackling fireplace, the sound of Marcus's evolving desperation filling the quiet room. The final one was barely more than a whisper. Dad, I'm so sorry. Then the line went silent, leaving only the sound of the fire and the distant murmuring of the sea. Elias sat there for a long time afterward. Part of him yearned to call immediately, to alleviate the torment in Marcus's voice. Another part wasn't ready. An apology mattered, profoundly so, but understanding mattered even more. He needed to know whether Marcus regretted simply hurting him, or if he regretted the consequences of that hurt. There was a subtle difference, a very important difference, and Elias needed to discern it. The next morning, Elias woke before dawn. The sea was still, a vast expanse of dark silk reflecting the nascent light. The snow-covered trees lining the cove stood motionless against the pale winter sky. He made coffee and watched the sunrise, a fiery spectacle that painted the horizon in hues of orange and rose. Then he picked up his phone. His thumb hovered over Marcus's name. Finally, with a resolve he hadn't known he possessed, he pressed call. Marcus answered before the first ring had even finished. Dad! His voice cracked, raw with emotion. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence thick with unspoken words and swirling anxieties. I'm okay, Elias said, his voice softer than he intended. The sound that came through the phone wasn't a word, but a ragged exhale. It sounded more like relief, pure, unadulterated relief. So potent it almost vibrated through the line. Thank God. Elias leaned back in his chair, a faint sigh escaping him. I heard your messages. Another pause stretched between them, fraught with meaning. Then, I'm sorry, Dad. Elias waited, letting the words hang in the air. Testing their weight, Marcus continued, his voice heavy. No. Elias agreed gently. It doesn't. Silence again. Then Marcus asked quietly, his voice pleading, Can we meet, Dad? Elias looked out at the tranquil, winter-kissed landscape, the distant lighthouse standing sentinel against the dawn. Maybe, please, Marcus urged, the single word carrying more weight, more genuine desperation than all 30 calls combined. Elias finally agreed. The next afternoon, they met halfway between Elias's coastal retreat and Marcus's city life, at a small, unassuming diner just off the old coastal highway, the kind of place with well-worn laminated menus, endless coffee refills, and the comforting aroma of fried food. Clara and Elias used to stop there years ago on their drives. Marcus arrived before Elias did. When Elias walked inside, his son was already sitting in a booth near the back, hunched over a cup of coffee. For a fleeting second, he looked like the young man who had left for university decades earlier, nervous, uncertain, vulnerable. He stood immediately when he saw Elias, his posture stiff, his eyes red-rimmed and shadowed. Neither of them hugged. Neither of them shook hands. They simply sat down facing each other across the formica table. The kind waitress brought Elias a mug of coffee, then wisely disappeared, sensing the charged atmosphere. For almost a full minute, neither of them spoke, the clatter of cutlery and muffled conversations from other patrons forming a distant hum around them. Finally, Marcus looked up, his gaze meeting Elias's. I deserve this, Dad. Elias took a slow sip of his coffee, the warmth a welcome contrast to the cold knot in his stomach. Deserve what, son? The silence. Elias didn't answer, allowing the silence to stretch, to do its work. Marcus looked down at the table, picking at a loose thread on the worn upholstery. Dad, I was awful. Elias remained quiet, not to punish him, but to allow him the space to continue, to truly articulate what was festering inside. Sometimes people needed room to tell the unvarnished truth. And eventually, Marcus did. I don't know when I became that person. He sounded genuinely bewildered, as if looking at a stranger in the mirror. Elias studied his face. Marcus looked exhausted, stripped of the confident, almost arrogant facade he usually presented. The stool wasn't the problem, Marcus. Elias said, his voice even. Marcus's eyes lifted, surprised. I know. The joke wasn't the problem either. Marcus's expression tightened, a grim acceptance dawning. I know. Elias nodded slowly. The problem is that you meant it. That landed hard, because it was undeniably true. You don't make comments like that unless they've already been living, festering, inside your head. For several seconds, Marcus stared at the table, his shoulders slumping. Then he nodded slowly. A profound weariness etched onto his face. You're right, Dad. The honesty surprised Elias. Most people, especially Marcus, would defend themselves, make excuses, deflect blame. Marcus didn't. Instead, he said something Elias wasn't expecting, something that revealed a deeper insecurity. I was embarrassed, Elias frowned. Embarrassed by what, son? Marcus looked deeply ashamed, his gaze dropping to the tabletop. The way you live, the cottage, the old truck, everything. The words hurt, even then. Even after everything Elias had been through, the sting of that admission was sharp. But he let Marcus continue, needing to hear the full confession. Serena's family has money. Their friends have money. Everyone talks about investments and lavish vacations and exclusive country clubs. Marcus swallowed hard, and every time they asked about my family, I felt like you didn't fit. The diner suddenly felt very quiet, not because of what Marcus said, but because of what it revealed. For years, Elias's son had been measuring human worth using the wrong ruler. Money, status, appearances. The superficial things that impress strangers, not the profound, enduring things that truly matter. Elias leaned back in the booth, his gaze fixed on Marcus. Do you know what your mother used to say, Marcus? Marcus shook his head, his eyes still downcast. She used to say, character is what remains after everything else gets taken away. Marcus's eyes slowly lowered, as if contemplating the depth of those words. Elias continued, his voice calm but firm. If you lose money, you're still a person. You can earn it back. Marcus nodded slowly. If you lose your job, you're still a person. You can find another nod. But if you lose your character, Elias let the sentence hang in the air, a silent, weighty challenge. Marcus finished it himself, his voice barely audible. Then you've lost everything. For the first time, tears appeared in his eyes. Not dramatic tears, not movie tears, but the quiet kind. The kind grown men try to hide. I read the files, Dad, Marcus said, his voice thick. Elias wasn't surprised. I figured. The tuition receipts. Elias nodded. The sextant. Elias nodded again. Marcus's voice broke, catching in his throat. I didn't know, Dad. You never told me. That wasn't the point, son, Elias murmured. Marcus's shoulders sagged, the truth finally, undeniably reaching him. Parents rarely advertise their sacrifices. Most of them didn't want applause, didn't expect repayment. They simply wanted their children to have opportunities they never had, a better path forward. For a few minutes, neither of them spoke, only the soft clinking of cups and the distant murmur of conversation filling the space. Then Marcus said something that mattered more than any apology, more than any expression of regret. I wasn't calling because of the money, Dad. Elias watched him carefully, searching for sincerity. The money shocked me, yes. Marcus paused, gathering his thoughts. But finding those files, finding those letters from Mom, seeing all you did for me, that shocked me more. The sincerity in his voice felt real, palpable. I spent years thinking I built my life myself, Dad. I thought I was self-made. His eyes, red-rimmed but clear, met Elias's. I forgot who carried me. That sentence hit Elias harder than he expected. Not because it fixed everything instantly, but because it showed understanding. Real understanding. And understanding, Elias knew, was where healing truly began. After another long silence, Elias finally told him something he hadn't planned to reveal, a decision he'd made in the quiet solitude of the inn. I met with the attorney, Marcus. Marcus's face tightened. I figured. We discussed my estate. Marcus nodded nervously. bracing himself for the axe to fall. Then Elias smiled slightly. Not a happy, joyous smile, just a small, almost wistful one. You know what surprised her the most, Marcus? What, Dad? How little I cared about the money itself. Elias continued, his gaze steady. Do you know what I cared about, son? Marcus shook his head, a mixture of apprehension and curiosity on his face. Elias looked directly at him. Whether my son respected me. The tears Marcus had been fighting finally escaped, tracing silent paths down his cheeks. He lowered his head, his shoulders shaking slightly. And for the first time in decades, Elias saw him as a little boy again. Not the successful architect, not the wealthy city dweller, not the accomplished adult. Just a son who realized he'd broken something precious, something irreplaceable, and was desperately hoping it wasn't too late to repair it. Then Elias told him the decision he had made about his future, and the future of his newfound inheritance. A decision that would surprise everyone, including Marcus. Marcus stared at Elias across the diner table, the coffee between them long since gone cold. Neither of them seemed to notice. Moments earlier, Elias had told him about the meeting with Ms. Davies, the attorney. Now Marcus was waiting for the rest, waiting to hear what Elias planned to do with this unexpected fortune. Perhaps a part of him feared Elias was about to tell him he'd been cut out of his life completely, removed from any future inheritance. Honestly, 2 days earlier, Elias might have considered it. Not because he wanted revenge, but because he was hurt, deeply and profoundly hurt. But age taught you something important. Permanent decisions made during temporary pain usually created permanent regret. So Elias had spent those 2 days thinking, truly thinking, not about money but about legacy. There was a difference, a crucial one. Money was what you left behind. Legacy was what you left inside people. Elias looked at Marcus, his eyes softened but unwavering. I made some changes, son. Marcus swallowed hard, I figured. But not the changes you probably imagine. Elias watched his son's eyes search his face, a flicker of uncertainty mixed with hope. Elias continued, most of that money is going somewhere else, Marcus. Marcus nodded slowly, a surprising lack of protest in his acceptance. I understand, Dad. The answer genuinely surprised Elias. No argument, no panic, no complaints, just quiet acceptance. Elias leaned back in the booth, a weight he hadn't realized he was carrying beginning to lift. I've set up scholarship funds. Marcus's eyebrows lifted slightly, a hint of genuine interest in his expression. For Coast Guard families in need. Marcus nodded, a small, genuine smile touching his lips. Good, Dad. Mom would have liked that. Yes, Elias agreed, his voice thick with shared memory. She would. I've also allocated substantial funds for maritime preservation societies, local community outreach programs, and several charities your mother supported. At the mention of Clara, both of them fell silent, a shared wave of poignant remembrance washing over them. Even after 6 years, her absence still felt profoundly present. Marcus smiled sadly. Mom would like that very much, Dad. Yes, she would. Elias took a deep breath. You're still in the estate, Marcus. Marcus's head immediately shook. Dad, that's not why. Elias held up a hand, stopping him. I know, son. And for the first time, Elias truly believed it. The man sitting across from him wasn't worried about inheritance anymore. He was worried about them. There was a difference, a big difference, that transcended any financial calculation. I didn't remove you, Elias reiterated, his eyes glistening with unshed emotion. But I need you to understand something very important. I'm listening, Dad. Inheritance isn't a reward. Marcus nodded. And it isn't an entitlement. Another nod. It's simply what's left behind after a life is over. The diner had become busy around them. People talked, plates clattered, coffee was poured. Yet, somehow, it felt like they were the only two people in the room, existing in their own bubble of raw emotion and profound understanding. I spent most of my life trying to give you opportunities, Marcus, Elias said, his voice softening with emotion. Marcus lowered his eyes, shame still evident. I know, Dad. But opportunities don't matter if they cost you your values. That sentence stayed with Marcus. Elias could see it sink in, a truth finally taking root. Then, for the first time since that disastrous Christmas dinner, Elias reached across the table and placed his hand firmly on Marcus's shoulder. The same shoulder he had patted after Little League games. The same shoulder he had held when Clara died. The same shoulder that now carried the immense weight of a grown man's regret. "You made a mistake, son." A single tear slipped down Marcus's cheek, tracing a path through the faint stubble on his jaw. "I know, Dad, it was a big mistake." Marcus's voice cracked, thick with emotion. "I know, Dad, I truly do. But mistakes aren't what define us, Marcus." Marcus looked up, his eyes pleading. "What does, Dad?" Elias smiled, a gentle, understanding smile. "What we do after them." For a long, poignant moment, neither of them spoke. Then something happened that Elias hadn't expected, something that bypassed words and spoke directly to the heart. Marcus stood up, walked around the booth, and hugged Elias. Not a quick, perfunctory hug, not an awkward, hesitant hug, a real one. The kind fathers remembered, the sons rarely gave once they became adults. Elias hugged him back, holding on tight, and somewhere deep inside, a wound, festering for too long, began to heal. Not disappear entirely, for some scars would always remain, but heal. Those were different things. Healing took time, patience, and effort. The months that followed weren't perfect. Life rarely worked that way. Trust wasn't rebuilt in a single conversation, no matter how profound. It was rebuilt through consistency, through effort, through deliberate choices made day after day. And Marcus worked hard, very hard. He started visiting every week, driving out to the coast. Sometimes they'd have breakfast at the local diner. Sometimes they'd watch old Coast Guard documentaries together, Elias sharing stories Marcus now listened to with rapt attention. Sometimes they'd just sit on the porch of the cottage, watching the sea, talking about nothing and everything. No agenda, no obligations, just father and son, the way it should have been all along. One Saturday, Marcus showed up with a toolbox in hand. "What are you doing, son?" Elias asked, genuinely surprised. Marcus grinned, a flicker of his old boyish charm returning. "Fixing your deck, Dad." Elias chuckled. "My deck is fine." "No," Marcus said, pointing decisively. "It isn't. The planks are rotting." The truth was, it wasn't. By evening, half the deck had been repaired. The next weekend, Marcus came back and finished it. A month later, he helped Elias organize his notoriously cluttered workshop. A month after that, he replaced several broken fence posts. None of those things were strictly necessary, but that was precisely the point. He wasn't trying to impress Elias with his architectural prowess or his newfound wealth. He was trying to show Elias who he wanted to become, a son who understood the value of hard work, humility, and connection. And slowly, Elias began believing him. Serena changed, too. To her credit, she apologized sincerely more than once, acknowledging her role in the evening. She admitted she had become too focused on appearances, too concerned with social status, too willing to stay silent when she should have spoken up. Over time, Elias's relationship with her improved as well, evolving into a quiet, respectful bond. Even Mr. Thorne, Serena's father, surprised Elias. One afternoon, several months after the Christmas dinner, his phone rang, displaying Mr. Thorne's name, Elias. Mr. Thorne's voice rumbled. "Mr. Thorne," Elias replied, a hint of curiosity in his tone. "I owe you an apology, Elias." Elias laughed softly. "For sitting in my chair, or for not getting out of it sooner?" That made him smile. They ended up talking for nearly an hour, sharing stories, not just about their children, but about their own lives and experiences. Life, Elias mused, had a funny way of humbling everyone eventually. Then, before Elias knew it, another Christmas arrived. Exactly 1 year later, the same city apartment, the same family, the same holiday, but not the same people. When Elias pulled into Marcus's driveway, snow was falling gently, dusting the cars and bare branches. The windows of the apartment complex glowed with warm, inviting light, almost exactly as they had the year before. For a moment, Elias sat in his old truck looking at the familiar scene, remembering the pain and the healing of the past year. Then he took a deep breath, a sense of peace settling over him, and walked inside. His grandchildren, Leo and Maya, ran toward him first, as always, their shouts of "Grandpa" echoing through the foyer. Their hugs, pure and unburdened by the complexities of adulthood, never changed. Thank God for that. The apartment smelled like roasted turkey and cinnamon, a comforting aroma. Laughter and conversation filled the rooms, a joyful cacophony. And then Marcus approached, his expression a mix of nervousness and anticipation. Dad. Elias smiled. Merry Christmas, son. Merry Christmas, Dad. Marcus looked genuinely excited. Come with me. He led Elias toward the dining area. The moment Elias entered, he stopped, his breath catching in his throat. There it was. His chair. Not the old uncomfortable stool from last year, but a new one. A beautifully handcrafted oak captain's chair, robust and elegant, positioned prominently at the head of the table. Everyone was already seated, their faces turned toward Elias, waiting. Marcus cleared his throat, and the room became quiet, all eyes on him. Then he looked at his guests, his gaze sweeping over each face before settling on Elias. He spoke, his voice steady and clear, imbued with a newfound strength and humility. This is my father, Elias Finch. Elias felt his throat tighten, a lump forming there. This man, Marcus continued, his voice unwavering, spent his life serving his country in the Coast Guard, ensuring the safety of countless lives at sea. No one spoke, the silence respectful, attentive. He sacrificed more for our family than I'll ever fully understand. The room remained silent, not awkwardly, but with a profound sense of reverence. He is the strongest, most honorable man I have ever known. Then Marcus smiled, a genuine, loving smile that reached his eyes. And that seat, at the head of our table, belongs to him. Elias couldn't speak. For a few seconds he honestly couldn't. Because the chair had never been about furniture. It had always been about something much deeper. Honor, gratitude, respect. The things that mattered most in life. He walked to the chair, his heart swelling, and sat down. His family, his children and grandchildren, and those who had become like family, gathered around him. And for the first time in many, many years, Christmas felt whole again. Not because of the money, not because of any inheritance, not because anyone had won an argument or gained a victory, but because a family, broken and adrift, had found its way back to each other, guided by the light of understanding and forgiveness. As Elias had grown older, he had learned something worth sharing, a truth owned by time and experience. The people who loved us won't be here forever. Parents age, children grow busy, life moves quickly, relentlessly forward. And sometimes, tragically, we don't realize someone's true value until we've nearly lost them. If you are fortunate enough to still have someone in your life who sacrificed for you, who loved you unconditionally, tell them. Don't wait for another Christmas. Don't assume they already know, because respect given late is still infinitely better than respect never given at all. And if this story, or a piece of it, reminded you of someone you love, perhaps call them today, perhaps thank them, perhaps forgive them. Life is shorter than we think, and family, when cared for properly, when nurtured with love and understanding, is one of the few treasures that truly grows more valuable with time, like a lighthouse standing steadfast against the ever-changing sea.